Good morning. I'm Janel Bakker, and I'm Associate Professor of Mission, Evangelism, and Culture at Memphis Theological Seminary. Thanks for joining in this morning. So this is the second in a two-part series in Sunday Morning Seminary. For Thine is the Kingdom, and we're going to be looking at Christianity and empire, past and present, the relationship between Christianity and political power. And last week we looked particularly at a historical angle at the relationship between Christianity and empire building. And today we're going to look more at the contemporary scene in the United States. So this is just a reminder from last week. We talked about the parameters of mission in the new paradigm, which has developed particularly since the middle of the 20th century by missiologists and practitioners who have responded to mission in the modern period, which was often linked to the expanding of territory and the linkage between Christianity and so-called Western culture. And within the new paradigm, the exploitative nature of the mission under the modern period, under the banner of civilize and Christianize in the United States, the doctrine of manifest destiny also being part of this sense of mission, and particularly with regard to the assumptions of the superiority of white peoples and white cultures with regard to the linking of mission with Western civilization and expansion of the territory of Christendom. So within the 20th century, particularly with much conversation and input and participation from Christians in the global South in a post-colonial ethos, the new paradigm of mission came to the fore. Now, certainly aspects of this new paradigm surfaced throughout history, but particularly among various camps of Christianity, Roman Catholics, mainline Christians, Christians within the Black church, Christians globally, and some evangelicals as well, this new paradigm developed. I think Carlos Cardoza Orlandi describes mission well within this new paradigm when he talks about the participation of the people of God in God's action in the world. So in the new paradigm, God is understood as the sender of mission rather than the church or the mission agency or individual Christians. Mission reflects God's effort to redeem, transform the world. Mission is at the center of the church's DNA. It's the reason the church exists. The church exists for the world. And the church is both the subject and object of mission. So the church is an agent of mission, but the church also is always in need of God's mission. And sometimes that can come into the church from outside of the church. Mission includes evangelism, but isn't limited to evangelism. Mission is considered however the church engages in the work that God is doing. Mission always requires contextualization, so a recognition that no context is neutral, and that when we communicate the gospel, we're doing so within our culture and our cultural perspective. None of us have a bird's eye view, and that culture is valued by God and cultural diversity is valued by God, so that the faith should be contextualized in every cultural setting. Within the new paradigm, another important feature is the slogan, not from the West to the rest, but from everywhere to everywhere. So mission isn't understood geographically as the expansion of Christian territory, but rather the gospel, the good news going forth from every part of the world to every other part of the world. Marginalized people have a special place within this new paradigm, and liberation theology is connected to the new paradigm, the preferential option for the poor and marginalized that we see in Jesus's ministry. and that the marginalized are not just recipients of mission, but the marginalized are agents of mission, that marginalized people, those who live in positions of oppression, poverty, are often much better in touch with what the good news is in their particular situation. So there's a sense in which those of us who are in dominant or privileged positions of society are called to walk alongside the marginalized in solidarity, rather than assuming that they are lacking something, or that we have answers and that we are in a better position than them to recognize and implement the will of God. Finally, within the new paradigm, a central feature is that mission is focused on Jesus' vision of the reign of God, or what the Greek New Testament calls the basileia to Theo. And I prefer this term to the kingdom of God because the original Greek doesn't have the gendered connotations. It doesn't have the top-down imperial connotations, but rather this vision of God's reign of justice and love and peace that is already here and not yet here at the same time. The basileia to Theo upends the logic of the world. The last are first, the first are last. And the basileia to Theo is not something that the people of God build or enlarge, but according to Jesus' conception in the New Testament, particularly the Gospels and particularly the parables, we see the reign of God as a gift that we are invited to receive, and as a realm to enter like a child. And we are invited into this reign of God to participate in the work that God is doing. But this reign of God, or the reign of heaven, the way that Jesus talks about this reign is that it is a reign in which all people, and especially those on the margins, flourish. We have this vision of shalom that we see, particularly in the prophetic literature of the Bible, that Jesus also points to in his vision of the reign of God. So let's just contrast that paradigm, particularly regarding evangelism, with the other models that we spoke about last week. So in the old paradigm or Christendom model, evangelism is about winning souls. There's almost this invisible ledger. You have the saved and the unsaved, and the idea is to bring people from the unsaved or the heathendom category to the saved or the Christianized category. And evangelism is connected to conquest, this idea of the receiver's culture being backward or demonic or inferior, and that quote unquote Christian culture, which was often linked in the modern period to European and North American norms and values. The two were connected. A one-directional movement in mission from the Western world to the rest of the world in the modern period. And that salvation is often reduced to 2 points in time. The death of Christ is seen as the moment that allows salvation, and then the conversion of the individual moves them from unsaved to saved, and the rest of human history is considered largely irrelevant. Salvation is mostly otherworldly, rather than being connected to being saved in this life for the life that God calls us to and offers. The church growth model, many would argue, is an extension of this old paradigm model. This came to the fore in the US, particularly in the 70s and 80s, with the goal of attracting people to church programs. And we start to see much more of a market economics approach to mission and evangelism. The attractional model sees the church as a firm with religious goods and services to offer, and thinks about how to market those religious goods and services. And that could be considered, a crass way to view many churches, but within this model, many churches overtly adopted these principles, seeing themselves as marketing their goods and services with a very therapeutic and individualistic emphasis. And not incidentally, many megachurches who adopted this model within the 70s and 80s in recent years have grown to question it. Finally, evangelism within this new paradigm, or Basileia to Thea model. Evangelism is not just sharing the good news about Jesus, which of course is very important. The death and the resurrection of Jesus, the incarnation, are certainly part of the good news within the new paradigm, but also the good news that Jesus proclaimed, the good news of the Sermon on the Mount, the good news of the parables about the reign of God. Again, we see this logic of the world being upended, where the last are first and the first are last. And this focus on receiving and entering the kingdom, the reign of God, the Basileia to Theo, rather than building it or enlarging it. Also a connection to one's own personal faith with regard to evangelism, that evangelism is about sharing what we have experienced, what we have experienced individually and collectively. Elaine Heath talks about evangelism as an outpouring of holiness, which certainly doesn't mean that Christians have arrived in any sense of the word, but that we can't give what we don't have. And so that experience of divine love is at the heart of the good news and at the heart of what Christians share. The invitation to evangelism is not to follow a set of rules or propositions, but to adopt a way of life that is based on this transformative experience of divine love within the new paradigm. And it starts with respect for the conversation partner, rather than an assumption that the conversation partner is wrong or that the conversation partner has no connection to the work of God in the world. But rather starts with an attitude of curiosity and mutual sharing. So if we look at the words of the Lord's Prayer, thy kingdom come, or thy Basileia come, that Jesus speaks about in the Gospels, we talked about how that line, thy kingdom come, has been misused in so many contexts within Christian history, and that the logic of destruction often ends with the logic of empire. Empires rise and empires fall. So what does it mean in our context to pray, thy kingdom come, to embrace the Basileia to Theo within our lives of faith and within our interactions with people in the world? I want to look at some examples in contemporary and the contemporary US with regard to how I see this continued approach to Christianity connected to empire. So we're going to start with some examples that I see as tragic and negative, and then move into some contemporary examples, however imperfect, that I think are praying thy kingdom come with this mission in the new paradigm approach, particularly with regard to embracing the Basileia to Theo. So we're going to start with something that happened just last week, and probably right in the middle of our session. President Trump visited the International Church in Las Vegas. Here you can see him with Hope Hicks. He's receiving a blessing from the pastors, Dennis Collette and her husband. Throughout the service, Trump is praised and embraced. He has applauded, standing ovation for the great job that he's doing. Hands are laid on him. And here Pastor Denise Collette is saying to Trump, God said to me that you were the apple of his eye. He is protecting you like he is protecting the ancient foundations of this nation. So you can see a lot of assumptions in her words there to Trump, the idea that this is a Christian nation or a Christian empire, that the interests of Christians and that the power of Christianity should be something that the president is particularly keen to protect and to push forward. The idea that Trump is somehow favored by God, this divine right of kings, all of this comes through in this service. Trump goes on, is given the microphone and goes on to say, "You're doing a great job." And this sort of mutual, back rubbing with evangelical Christians, particularly white evangelical Christians, and Donald Trump has been happening throughout his original campaign and his presidency, with the idea that Trump in particular will protect the interests of white Christians. And we see this come through. Trump even announced this week that he's no longer Presbyterian, he's a non-denominational Christian, signaling to white evangelical Christians that he's on their team. Let's go back a few years. This is October 17. On the bottom left, you can see a picture of Dr. Robert Jeffress, senior pastor of First Baptist Church in Dallas, a Southern Baptist congregation. And in this particular Sunday, the special guest was none other than Sean Hannity, who has been an ardent Trump supporter, proffering conspiracy theories, and also embracing this notion of Trump as God's chosen. Dr. Robert Jeffress has repeatedly embraced Trump and even done so from the pulpit, which is in violation of his nonprofit, the church's nonprofit status. Nonetheless, there's this connection of power and empire that I think we can observe in this particular instance as well. Here we see Sean Hannity speaking at First Baptist Church. You can see the huge crowds of people gathered to hear him market his new movie and to praise Donald Trump. I also want to rewind even further. So a speech that Donald Trump gave in January of 2016, sorry, I got the wrong date on my slide. This speech, I think, is especially hits home for me because it was given at my alma mater for my undergraduate education, Dordt College in Northwest Iowa. And in this speech, Donald Trump said, "Christianity will have power. If I'm in the White House, or I'm there," I think was the exact quote, "you're going to have plenty of power." At another point in the speech, Trump also said that he could shoot somebody up in Fifth Avenue and none of his supporters would care, indicating that this protection that he offers and the elevation of perceived interests, particularly of white Christians on the right, was something that would make him unstoppable. This summer, there have been two authors that have gained a lot of attention, and both of them revisit this speech given on the campaign trail in January of 2016. The first is Kristen Kobus-Dumais, who published the book Jesus and John Wayne. She's looking at the connection between Christianity and what I would deem a toxic masculinity, arguing that Christians have embraced strong men like Donald Trump, not in spite of their, uncouth and combative language, but because of it, that they see in figures like Donald Trump a champion for their cause. And this relates to the hierarchical ordering of humanity that we see with regard to gender and race in American Christianity. And the second author is Elizabeth Diaz, who is a journalist for the New York Times. Both of them study historically as well as sociologically ways in which white evangelical Christians have embraced Donald Trump at 81% in 2016, and the numbers are looking quite similar in the coming election, and that this notion of power and privilege for the interest groups, that they will be protected, and that they will be given the normative status within American culture is something that has been very attractive to this group. I want to theorize about, particularly about this connection between white Christianity and power, political power in the United States. And first I want to do that by looking to Charles Taylor, who wrote the book A Secular Age, which made a lot of waves. And Charles Taylor argues that there are three forms of secularization. There's been a lot of theorizing about secularization as Europe has become increasingly secular, with less than 5% of most in most Western European countries of religious observance, regular religious observance. And in the United States, the unaffiliated is quickly becoming one of the largest religious groups in the United States, and is growing dramatically by about 15 points over the last 15 years. So secularization has often been defined by a decline in religious beliefs and behaviors. So people go to church less, they pray less, and then also sometimes defined by a decline in the authority of religious institutions. So religious institutions shrinking, losing money, not having as much sway over their parishioners. But Charles Taylor draws attention to a third dimension of secularization, which he calls changing cultural conditions, rendering religion optional or irrelevant. So the sidelining of religion in the public square, and that religion becomes optional. If you want to do that, that's great, but keep it out of public life. And that it doesn't really matter. What matters in life is not directly connected to religion or religious worldview. And it is this definition of secularization, according to Charles Taylor, which we often see a backlash to. And I think that if we look at secularization through this lens, we can see the attraction of a figure like Donald Trump promising power to a contingency believing themselves to be beleaguered and minoritized. And evangelical Christians also are on polls. They receive the highest percentage points in terms of their perceptions of being persecuted and minoritized and marginalized. So these perceptions of losing power, losing cultural influence, make it very attractive to seek to try to regain that power. Another theorist I want to look at is Emilio Gentile. He's an Italian scholar, and he wrote a book about the sacralization of politics in fascist Italy. And many scholars since then have used his work to look at the sacralization of politics in other environments. Michelle Margolis is a recent example in the United States, a sociologist who has argued that we often look at religion influencing people's politics, but it's really important to also see the reverse, that for many people, politics is elevated to the level of ultimate concern and becomes sacred, becomes part of people's most sacred values. And particularly in the polarized environment of the United States, we are seeing this sacralization of politics more and more. So I want to look at James Davison Hunter. James Davison Hunter was one of the original proponents of the culture war thesis, arguing that Americans have largely been divided into two camps, the progressives and the traditionalists, or the conservatives and the liberals. And recently he wrote a book to change the world, in which he argues that there's this Achilles heel for anyone seeking to change the world, and particularly looking at Christians in the United States. And that is that when Christians in the United States have sought to change the world, they have often adopted the very same methods and ideas of those that they are seeking to change. So he's arguing that this idea of seeking to change the world is connected with power and the power over other people, so that many Christians seeking to change the world, to enlarge or expand the kingdom of God, in doing so, the quest for power to win, to triumph, becomes an important dimension undergirding that work. Let's look at some theological responses, particularly within the contemporary American setting, looking at the link between Christianity and political power. This is Diana Butler Bass, who is a church historian and a theologian within the Episcopal tradition. And she was responding particularly to the attention that was given to the Trump speech in 2016, in which he talked about Christians having power. And she says, Christianity will have power. This slogan, this isn't the problem. Christianity doesn't lack for power. Christianity has power. It always has. That's the heart of the story. But then she goes on to ask, what kind of power does Christianity have? And she talks about the power that Jesus proclaimed, the power to bless the poor, heal the sick, welcome the stranger, share a table with outcasts and sinners, turning hierarchies upside down, the power of peace, the power of humility, contrasting this power with the power of empire. Let's also look at some of the ideas of the late priest, Robert Farrar Capone, who has written a lot about Jesus's conception of the Basileia to Theo, particularly in the parables of Jesus. And he speaks about the left-handed power of God, borrowing a term from Martin Luther. And the left-handed power of God is what we see, according to Robert Farrar Capone, in the Gospels. This is a power with and for, rather than a power over. It is not the power of conquest. It is not the power of defeat. It is not the power of being in control, but rather it is the power of presence and the power of walking alongside those who are suffering. I also want to look at the work of Dietrich Bonhoeffer. Dietrich Bonhoeffer knew a little something about the linkage of Christianity and political power, and about empire and power over others. Dietrich Bonhoeffer is living in Germany during the time of the Nazi rise to power. And as a pastor in the Lutheran Church in Germany, the state church of Germany, he watches aghast as many and most of his colleagues align with Hitler, and doing so with the idea that the church has been beleaguered, Germany has been disrespected, and that the elevation of Christianity and German peoplehood in the person of Hitler is something to be applauded. Dietrich Bonhoeffer, of course, went in a very different direction, being one of the leaders of the confessing church, speaking out about Nazism, speaking out against persecution of the Jews. Eventually, he joins a plot to try to overthrow Nazism and assassinate Hitler. He struggled with that decision throughout his life. He believed that the Sermon on the Mount was the heart of Christ's teachings, and he considered himself a pacifist. Yet he also considered that not trying to stop Hitler was worse. So he is imprisoned when this plot is discovered. And while he is in prison, shortly before his death in a Nazi concentration camp, he wrote a series of letters and papers. And within these papers, one of the ideas that comes out especially is what he called religionless Christianity. And what he says, a quote from Letters and Papers in Prison regarding this conception of religionless Christianity: man's religiosity makes him look in his distress to the power of God in the world. God is the Deus ex machina. The Bible directs man to God's powerlessness and suffering. Only the suffering God can help. So according to Bonhoeffer, this quest for power is a misperception of what faith is all about, and that rather God's power can be seen in powerlessness and suffering. He talked about the vicarious representative action of Jesus and our call to follow Jesus in that vicarious representative action, being the church for the world, being in solidarity with those who are suffering and marginalized. Another theologian that I think brings so many insights to the table is Howard Thurman. Howard Thurman was a 20th century theologian and a mentor to Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. In his book, Jesus and the Disinherited, Howard Thurman talks about Jesus's relationship with those with their backs against the wall. Not only did Jesus see these people as his friends and disciples, but that Jesus himself was someone with his back against the wall and someone who was eventually killed by the state. And for Howard Thurman, he recognizes that the power that is in you is greater than the power in the world. And for Thurman, the dignity and the joy that the Spirit of God provides within the life, particularly of those with their backs against the wall, is something that no one else can take away. And this is the power of the gospel, the power of a man who's dying on a cross. We see this in the theology of James Cone and many other liberationists coming after Howard Thurman, the focus on the power that is in you, particularly for those who are marginalized. So I also want to look at some examples of Christians who are seeking to live into this notion of mission as joining in the work of God in the world with an eye to the basileia to Theo, the reign of God's justice, love, and peace. And certainly these organizations, groups of Christians are doing this work imperfectly with fits and starts. But I think it's helpful to draw attention to some examples. The first is the Catholic worker community. The Catholic worker was founded by Peter Morin, a French Catholic, a French-Canadian Catholic who eventually found his way to New York City, and Dorothy Day, a woman who had lived a bohemian life until her conversion to Catholicism in the 1930s. The Catholic worker focused on the Catholic faith and Christianity more generally as a faith of the poor, and believed that only by being in relationship with the poor could Christians see the face of God, that within every person gathered, no matter how insignificant or how repulsive, that this was the face of Christ in these people. Fritz Eisenberg, who was one of the artists for the Catholic Workers newspaper and other publications, has this lithograph of the Last Supper of the folks that Jesus gathered with. and what they might look like in a contemporary setting. The Catholic Worker focused on the rights of workers and the rights of those who are poor and marginalized, and from a personalist perspective. And to this day, there are hundreds of Catholic worker communities in the United States around the world seeking to live in solidarity with the poor and houses of hospitality, while also advocating for the transformation of American political life to instead of building war, to proffer peace and to protect the rights of people who are marginalized in society. Another example is the National Museum for Peace and Justice, which is a museum that opened in 2018. And the museum is sponsored by the Equal Justice Initiative under the leadership of Bryan Stevenson, who is a civil rights leader and also a Baptist Christian. And the National Museum for Peace and Justice aims to tell the story of racism in the United States, particularly with a focus on lynchings in the American South. And you can see the monuments with regard to folks who were lynched, African Americans who were lynched all throughout the American South in the Jim Crow era and beyond. And under the leadership of Bryan Stevenson and the Equal Justice Initiative, the National Museum and Monument for Peace and Justice aims to bring the story of abuse, state-sponsored executions, and the oppression of African Americans to light for the purpose of healing. A local example is the Lynching Sites Project in Memphis, which also aims to tell the story of racism and racial oppression in the Memphis area. Initially, the project was called the Clergy Lynching Sites Project. Many of the leaders within the Lynching Sites Project in the Memphis area, who are putting up historical markers, who are engaging in services of lament and truth-telling, forgiveness-seeking. Many of those involved are clergy within the Memphis area. The Kino Border Initiative is another effort I want to highlight to be in solidarity with those who are marginalized. The Kino Border Initiative is a Jesuit-sponsored initiative on the border of Mexico and the United States in Nogales, Arizona, and Nogales, Mexico. The Kino Border Initiative is engaged in hospitality, particularly to undocumented migrants who are deported. Oftentimes when undocumented migrants are deported, they are just left at the border with nothing but the clothes on their back. So the Kino Border Initiative is a place of sanctuary and respite within the Nogales, Mexico side of the border. They are also engaged in educational efforts and advocacy efforts for the rights and dignity of migrants. Homeboy Industries in Los Angeles is another effort involving Christians seeking to live in solidarity with the poor and marginalized, and Christians who are poor and marginalized. Homeboy Industries is an organization, again, connected to the Catholic Church. Father Greg Boyle is one of the founders of Homeboy Industries, working particularly with men who have a history in gangs, and Homeboy Industries seeking to provide an environment not of judgment, but an environment of embrace, and recognizing that God looks on all people with divine love, and as Julian of Norwich spoke of, with pity and not with blame. Those words, of course, I think reflect a different of context and a different linguistic context than we might use today, but this sense of God's empathy towards us rather than condemnation, and sharing that same spirit, building skills and community with folks who have been in gangs, and that those folks are not just recipients of services, but they are agents of God's love for each other and for the community. Thistle Farms in Nashville is another example of Christian community seeking to live into the Basileia to Theo. The Thistle Farms community is made up of women who have been trafficked or who have engaged in sex work or both. And the community seeks to build a sense of love and solidarity and skills for rebuilding lives. They have a cafe, they sell herbs and lotions and other beauty care products. And leadership in the community is shared by women who have been participants in the community and is not a top-down leadership style from those who have not experienced prostitution or trafficking. And finally, I want to look at the Poor People's Campaign. So the Poor People's Campaign was started under the Civil Rights Movement of the 1960s. It has recently been revived and is currently led by Reverend Liz Theo Harris and Dr. William Barber. A calling for moral revival, calling for accountability of the government on behalf of the poor and marginalized. And the Poor People's Campaign especially gives voice to this idea of power with and for rather than power over. It is not a partisan movement, but a movement to build power, particularly for those on the margins, and to end militarization and ecological devastation, and to lift the voices of poor and low-income Americans. So this effort, again, seeking to live into the Basileia to Theo with a particular focus on the interests and the voices of those who are impoverished. So for each of these efforts, certainly there have been fits and starts, and it's easy to slide into an old paradigm model of mission with those who have cultural power, having power within the organization and mission efforts. But I think each of these examples from an ecumenical perspective are efforts to seek to live into the Basileia to Theo as our call for mission today. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing my screen and I'm going to turn to any questions that are in the chat or the Q&A. So if any of you have any questions or comments, please add them to the Q&A or the chat so we can address them there. We'll wait a few minutes if anybody has a question or comment in the chat. And feel free to provide examples from your context or community which you think embody this new paradigm approach to mission, seeking to eschew a power over or an expansion of Christian power, which is often white Christian power in our context, and instead are seeking to live into a power with and a power for approach of receiving and entering the Basileia to Theo, the reign of God. So the first question I'm seeing here, what about specific forms of empire today? Does the American empire or a global economy hold specific insights about the imperial powers God is working against today? So I think this is a really poignant question related to imperial power, especially as the American economy is still, although there's worries and fears about China kind of passing up the American empire. There's still the perception that the American empire is the most powerful today. And I think we can see this with regard to labor rights of folks around the world. So as we think about American empire, oftentimes we don't like to think of ourselves that way, but in a globalized world, the trade deals that we have often struck, the privileges given to multinational corporations benefit the wealthiest of Americans and hurt people on lower rings of the ladder, both in the United States and around the world. So if we look at, even the textile industry, for instance, that most clothes that are marketed and sold in the United States are made by very low wage workers in unsafe conditions around the world. So those of us who, buy these clothes are participating in an imperial economy that hurts the planet and hurts those who are working to make our clothes. So I think this is an example of Christians who seek to embrace the reign of God, that we follow the supply chain. And I know it's very difficult, given the structures of our contemporary economy, that we're all complicit and we can't not be. But for Christians to work for just wages for people around the world, to advocate for the rights, the dignity and well-being of workers, and also for environmental protection. I think another aspect of imperialism is a pillaging of the natural environment, seeing the earth as just a shell for us to extract the resources that we might choose. So a respect for the ecological order as well as the rights of workers, I think, is an important part of reflecting upon American empire. I also think we can look at the militarization of the American government, the huge percentage of taxes that go to fund militarization, and the way that the US uses its military power to protect its economic interests. And I think for Christians, there is also a call to examine that militarization. Dorothy Day famously, during the air raids in the Cold War, refused to seek cover. Instead, she and other members of the Catholic worker movement would sit on the park benches of New York City. She refused to pay her federal taxes for this reason as well. That she said that wars would end when, or that American militarization would end when citizens would stop paying for it, and that she didn't want it to appear normal, for economic warfare to appear normal or survivable, that nuclear warfare should never be normalized. And so Dorothy Day and her fellow Catholic worker colleagues protested against that militarization in those ways. The second question, what role does the lack of separation of church and state and England have to do with the lessening of religiosity there? So there is a lot of theorizing about the church-state relations and how that relates to participation. Some sociologists of religion have argued that a state church is inherently going to be a weak church. And if we look at Max Weber, there is a he talks about church sect typologizing. And for Weber, the state church is a weak church because there's no competition. And there have been many sociologists that have argued that state churches often end up being a tool of the empire. They are chaplains to the empire, and they lose their capacity to resist. They lose their prophetic dimension. And so the state church in England and other parts of Europe, that establishment ends up working against those churches. If we look back to the Roman Empire in the Constantinian period and beyond, the state church had a ton of power. But eventually we see the demise of that power, and we see the church being losing its sense of integrity in the process. So I think the linking of church and state and the establishment of state-sponsored churches certainly has an underbelly. So Scott Prather has responded in the Q&A, the Pentagon being the biggest polluter around. I think certainly we can see connections between militarization and environmental destruction. Here's a question from Margot. COVID has significantly impacted my capacity for hospitality. With winter coming, I am wrestling with how to love my friends still living on the street when inviting them into a warm, welcoming place doesn't look like it will be an option. Any reflections on the challenge of COVID and care? Margot, this is a really important and very painful question. And I think that many folks in Memphis and all around the world are dealing with the same question about how we can offer care and be in solidarity with people when the traditional means of doing so are dangerous. And I think there are some creative efforts going around in our city, at least, of putting up sanitizing stations and portable sinks and latrines, using these opportunities to care for our neighbors who are unhoused by providing opportunities for sanitation that wouldn't exist otherwise. There are also organizations in our city that are seeking to extend hospitality in modified ways with masking, distancing, and figuring out how hospitality can be done that way. But unfortunately, I don't know that I have many answers to that question other than to say that I wrestle with you. And I think it's a huge tragedy and loss during this time period, both with regard to solidarity with marginalized folks and I think human connections in general. If we look at table fellowship as a central part of Jesus's ministry and how difficult table fellowship is during this time. So with you, I lament that loss and very much think about our friends who are unhoused and the additional marginalization that they might face. I do think that as, if we look on the other side of the pandemic, which hopefully will be in our future, that it is an opportunity for us to create new patterns, new ways of being in community. And I hope that this time of disruption will provide some opportunities for permanent changes in the way that we might deal with each other and how we might prioritize each other, particularly as we see increased marginalization in American society during the pandemic. Well, I don't see any other questions in the Q&A, so I think we will go ahead and end there. I want to thank everybody again for joining, And if you are interested in any other sessions from the Sunday morning seminary, please go to the Memphis Theological Seminary website where you can find the sessions there. And as we end our session, I want to encourage each of you in your participation in the work of God. And that sometimes I think we can get very discouraged when we think about the reign of God as now and not yet. Sometimes it's hard to see it working now. But there's, I think, almost an act of holy defiance as we seek to live into the reign of God, and we seek to resist the imperial logic of our world. So thanks again for joining, and all the best to each of you in the week ahead.